Hello. Thank you. Welcome to the Climate Change and Ecology PAC for March. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Nice to see you. Attendees, we have the committee. Nice to see everybody attending this evening. And unfortunately, I don't think the cabinet member for... Oh, I think he's sent apologies. Yeah. And thank you very much for the officers and to Dr. Gary Fuller for coming. And thank you. And welcome to tonight's meeting. My name's Nicole Trahey. I will chair the meeting tonight. And before we begin, there's some housekeeping points. This meeting is being live streamed on YouTube. By taking part, you are consenting to being recorded. Please can officers introduce themselves before speaking for the first time, and guests. And if the fire alarm sounds either continuously or intermittently, I will adjourn the meeting. Officers will direct you to the assembly point in Shortlands Road. Please leave in an orderly fashion by the nearest exit, which is in the lift lobby down the stairs. Yes, apologies for absence. I think Councillor Wesley Harcourt. And declarations of interest. No declarations of interest. Thank you. The minutes for the meeting held on the 31st of January 2023. Does the committee agree the minutes? Yes. Yep, agreed. Thank you very much. Now, on to tonight's particularly the first subject. We have invited a brilliant guest, Dr. Gary Fuller, to come and give a discussion on air quality and the use of hard fuel burning, particularly wood burning, and to introduce us to what that means on a day-to-day basis for our air pollution. So I think we'll just get on with it and go straight over to Gary. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you to the committee for inviting me along. I'm Dr. Gary Fuller. I'm an air pollution scientist at Imperial College London, and you'll be aware that Imperial is strengthening its campus right here in your area, up at White City, and that's bringing in a lot of environmental scientists. So I look forward to a lot more interaction in the future between the council and the research evidence that we produce. If I could ask for my first slide to go up there, please. Thanks very much. So, as I said, I'm from Imperial College London. My contact details are there, and these slides are available in the PAC and online. In addition to working at Imperial as a scientist, I'm also part of the Clean Air Programme, where I'm a UKRI Clean Air Champion. And it's our role to be, if you like, scientific ambassadors for a portfolio of research that's going on in the UK around clean air. So I won't talk too much about that, but if you're interested, you can follow the links there on the presentation. If I could have my next slide, please. I think it would be too easy to frame air pollution from home burning in terms of it being, let's say, a technical challenge or a scientific challenge. Undoubtedly, and you as councillors especially are exposed to this a great deal, and as officers on a daily basis. What we see through many air pollution issues is that they are social issues, they are behavioural issues, and especially so when it comes to wood burning, the choices that we make about how we keep our homes warm and the impacts of that. And I put up this little slide here, just really as a reminder all the way through that you have to think about this through my presentation as we're talking about a social issue that's under the heart of it. And keeping the home fires burning, here we have something from the First World War, and there are loads of other things, the hearth at the heart of a home. And these things, you know, play deeply into people's sense of their home, their comfort, their family. And we have to bear this in mind all the way through. If I could have my next slide, please. We talk about air pollution and why are we concerned about this? Well, we're concerned about this because of the impact it has on our health. And there's various estimates of the numbers of people that die early each year because of the air pollution that they've been exposed to. For the UK, these range between about 40,000 and up to around 100,000. The most official one is the one in red there, which is a range between about 29 and 43,000, which is one of the latest ones as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, well, if we look into London, which is a subset of the UK, of course, work been done by my colleagues at Imperial has estimated that between 3,600 and 4,100 deaths are happening in London annually because of the air that we breathe. And these are people whose lives are being affected. Their disease is being brought forward. They're dying earlier than they would do. It's really brought to a kind of personal issue with Ella Deborah, who you'll be aware lived on the South Circular and is the first person in the UK to have air pollution listed as a cause of death. And I put her picture there with her family's permission, just as a reminder that these are people's lives that are actually being affected rather than it just being abstract statistics. If I could have the next slide, please. We often talk about deaths from air pollution, but some of the new research raises an interesting question about whether the impacts from air pollution are actually hiding almost in plain sight in the everyday ailments and diseases that afflict the lives of so many people, affecting their life quality, affecting their ability to contribute to society, to be able to go to places of education, to be able to work, to be able to do caring roles within their family. I highlight this paper here that was produced at the end of last year, where they looked at people in the UK living with chronic disease, and that's multiple chronic diseases. And you can see in the two panels there on the top right-hand side, you'll see two graphs, which I'll point at here and here. And this shows the relationship between the probability of having chronic long-term diseases or more than one chronic long-term disease and air pollution. And you can see a really straight linear relationship. And I think this raises the question, as I say, that within the chronic diseases that we're seeing, be it everything from things we've not traditionally associated with air pollution, from dementia to mental health, lung disease, heart disease, and even things to do with bone health as evidence is emerging. What we find, and there's been a lot of debate in the UK about our new limit for 2040 that's been set for England, and the difference between living in an area above this new limit and an area below, according to this study and the data here, there's an extra 20% chance of suffering with more than one chronic disease. Could I have the next slide, please? What we also find is that air pollution is affecting our young people. It's affecting people through from when they're conceived all the way through their life course. We did a study in East London with several thousand school children, and we measured the development of their lungs and connected this with the air pollution that they breathed. And we found that children growing up in London were on average losing their lungs were smaller because of the air pollution they breathed. Now, they probably won't notice this themselves. This difference in lung development, and these are 9 and 10-year-olds, is approximately the volume of 2 hens' eggs. So if you can think perhaps of a 9 or 10-year-old in your family or street or something like that, and think about the volume of 2 hen's eggs within their chest, that's about the lost lung development that these children are suffering. And it raises the point, if we have raises the risk, and we don't actually know this, but if we have a cohort of children that are growing up today with underdeveloped or smaller lungs, will it be leaving us a legacy of ill health for the future? And you might think of elderly members of your own family. I can certainly think of my grandparents and my dad these days. When he gets ill, when he, coughs and colds, it really does affect, it goes to his chest, as he would say. But anyway, so are we producing a generation that will be more vulnerable? Next slide, please. There is some interesting work out there that has looked at air pollution exposure in one part of life having impact in another. Some early work that's referenced there on the left-hand side took 1% of the UK census in 1971 and followed them for the next 40 years. Well, not literally followed them, looked at their appearance in every census that then followed. And what they found was their probability of dying between censuses, mainly related to the air pollution they had in that 10-year period. But you could also see an association with the air pollution they'd had experienced up to 40 years before. I'll talk briefly about the 1952 smog, but it was interesting that the 1952 smog, the cohort of children that were under the age of 1 at that time in London, including those that were, within their, were yet to be born, were, within pregnancy, went on to have an approximately 20% greater chance of developing asthma in childhood, compared with the kids that were born in the years either side, and compared with those that were born contemporaneously in other large UK cities. So there is, an early life impact later on. Could I have the next slide, please? So here is the 1952 smog, and this winter that we just had marks 70 years of that. And it's an important anniversary. It was the greatest disaster to affect London, with death rates that were far greater than the worst cholera outbreaks of Victorian times, for instance. If I could have the next slide, please. So there's a really nice connection between the problems that London experienced in 1952 and the topic of my talk this evening, which is the way that people heat their homes. And for a long time, through Victorian times and through the first half of the 20th century, there was a real reluctance to tackle the air pollution that was coming from solid fuel heating in people's homes. And part of the reason for this was the sort of statistical view that only 18% of UK coal was used to heat homes, and therefore it couldn't be the majority part of the problem. But the air pollution measurements that were going on at that time showed that this 80% of UK coal, in fact, created 60% of the winter time particle pollution that was experienced in our cities. Now, today, we don't have the same prevalence of solid fuel burning as we had at that time, but we have an effect whereby a small number of homes in the UK that are burning solid fuel are producing really quite a large proportion of our particle pollution. So around 8% of UK homes burn fuel, solid fuel for heating, mostly wood, but yet this produces more particle pollution than all of the exhausts from the vehicles on our roads. So it's a real problem, and it's one that we've really overlooked. If you go and talk to policymakers, you'll see this little timeline that runs along the bottom of the slide, with the advent of fossil gas in the 1970s. Most people's living rooms look like the one on the left with the fireplaces blocked up. It was just so much better. Not certainly for I remember my grandmother and my mum, to having to keep a home clean that had a coal fire in it was just so difficult, and it kind of relieved them of this huge task of making a fire. It's kind of transformative in the same way as getting a washing machine was. But over time, and in the last century, people have been opening up fireplaces and also installing new wood burners. Sales of stoves, we know from the industry, run about 150,000 homes per year having wood burning stoves fitted. And the thing to remember here is about all of the options and the different ways you have to heat your home. The use of solid fuel is the most polluting way to do it. And that's an important take-home message. If I could have the next slide, please. So there's quite a bit of data on this one and quite a bit of text as well. A lot of this is drawn from a very large survey that was done by DEFRA, where I was on the steering committee for this, where researchers went out to around 50,000 UK homes to find out about the way in which they were heating them and to ask a lot of questions about behaviour. So if you think about my very first slide, really, you know, this is a social phenomenon. It's not just an environmental one. It's not just a technical and engineering one. So what they found was that if we look at, you can project from this data and work out that 27% of the primary PM2.5, so these are really small particles that enter our lungs, that is being produced in the UK is coming from people burning solid fuel at home. 3/4 of that is coming from wood. And this, as I said before, is more than twice the particles we're getting from transport, from vehicle exhausts. In London, we have a slightly different method of estimating it through measurement, and I could describe the difference between the two later, but we estimate that around 17% of the primary PM2.5 is coming from domestic wood burning. In the UK as a whole, we think about 8% of homes are burning wood indoors. In London, it's lower. I mean, there's less ready supply of wood here. So we reckon it's around 3% of UK homes. So that's lower than the average. And there are some areas of the UK that do a lot of solid fuel burning. Northern Ireland, for reasons that I can discuss in questions, and also in rural areas burn a lot more. So when it comes to who's burning wood and why they're doing so, this survey found that only 4% of UK homes that burn wood are relying on it for heating. Yeah. Only 8% of people said that they burnt wood for necessity when asked. And one of the largest sort of segments and reasons why people burnt wood, so 46%, was being burnt for what people described as tradition, they'd already done it, or for aesthetics. This is also predominantly, we hear a lot about it being a fuel poverty issue, and I think there are some real issues of fuel poverty. But at the time this survey was done, which is before the current energy crisis, 46% of the homes that burnt wood were in the top 2 social grades. Yeah, so undoubtedly it's a middle class and upper middle class phenomena. There's a little bit about outdoor wood burning, but I'll draw your attention to some slides, and the industry that represents the wood burning people that want to sell and manufacture wood burners point a lot to outdoor burning as being the cause of these problems and bonfires and so forth. And yes, they do exist. So the top panel there shows some different locations in the UK and shows a year in terms of time. Yeah. So we have winter at the two ends, and we see the concentration of wood burning that we've measured in different places in the UK as the coloured lines. And what you can see is undoubtedly this is not a summertime phenomena when people are in their gardens or burning wood. What we see very much is that it's a wintertime phenomena. If you look in the next panel down, that describes time of day, and you can see that most wood burning is occurring not when you would expect people to be having a bonfire, let's say in the afternoon, but in the evening times. And we can also see some evidence in days per week. Sundays before Christmas are very popular when you have the family round to entertain, so you don't have to have them on Christmas Day. People light a fire a lot then. But interestingly, it doesn't seem to actually be going up. So the bottom panel shows some long-term trends in wood burning over just over 10 years in the UK. And against expectations, and it's interesting as a scientist, when you go in thinking what you're going to find and your results actually tell you something very different, we're not finding that this problem is really getting worse. So over this whole more than a decade period, we're finding that it's remaining fairly constant. So what we hypothesize, and there's some evidence to support this from the who burns what in what way. We hypothesize that people are starting with open fires and there's one set that's upgrading them to stoves that produce less pollution, and that's offsetting a total expansion in the number of people that are burning wood. Yeah. So that leaves us something that's about constant. However, if you do look at those figures closely, and you can look at this in the presentation at home. So the yellowish one on the bottom right-hand side is North Kensington. So just a couple of kilometres away from here. You can see there's a few little pips there at the end. And this is what could be an increase of wood burning in lockdown. And it leaves a lot of question about what's happening with rising energy prices, because that's another important component of this. There's a lot of people that are really struggling to heat their homes. So we'll see how that data emerges. Could I have the next slide, please? That's probably the most data-rich slide here, I think. So what you burn and how you burn it really matters. There's this very nice graphic on the left-hand side that shows different appliances going from an open fire on the left-hand side all the way through heating your home with electricity in the other one. And the size of the cloud describes how much particle pollution is produced by the different methods. And you can see that there is a lot more particle pollution produced by open fires than by more modern types of stove. And the industry will tell you this a lot as well. Part of the downside of this is we find that when people start with an open fire and then they invest in a wood burning stove, because they've invested in it, they use it a lot more. So we find that people are with stoves burn them nearly twice as much as those with open fires. So that offsets some of the benefit from upgrading, if you like, the home heating. One of the other things, and I can't help, we have to remember issues of fuel poverty and people struggling to keep warm, is that in London over the last winter and in the years before, actually, we're starting to see really strong evidence that people just don't burn wood. There is stuff uncovered from the DEFRA survey about people going out, taking material from skips, for instance. And what we found, and I wrote this piece, I'm a contributor to The Guardian. I wrote this piece in January, about January's data, and we're finding arsenic in London's air in the terms of the particles that we breathe. And this arsenic is arising in the air at the same time as other chemicals from wood burning. And what it looks like, and it's been seen in other places, is that people are burning waste wood. And waste wood, they're burning waste construction wood. And construction wood up to about 2006 was impregnated with arsenic compounds to try to prevent woodworm and rot. And when that's burnt, the arsenic's then released into the air. And in some communities, not really in the UK, but some intense wood burning communities in other places in the world have arsenic concentrations that would be illegal in the UK because of burning waste wood. But we're seeing it here too. Could I have the next slide, please? So impacts on indoor air pollution. The wood burning doesn't just impact our outdoors air, it impacts indoor. There's not a huge amount of research in UK homes on the impacts of air pollution indoors. There's one study which is on the left-hand side. There's a piece that was written by Damien Carrington in The Guardian, and I recommend you read the Guardian piece before you then go into the paper, because it's a much better, it's a really good summary. The right-hand side shows an experiment I did in my own house around 2010 on a Sunday afternoon when everyone was out. And I took home some instrumentation and I kind of opened it out on the kitchen table just to see what it was all about. And I have a modern home. We don't have any solid fuel burning. We have a gas gas central heating. And what I found as I was playing with this instrumentation, you can see there, as the afternoon goes on, the air pollution was deteriorating in my house, but I wasn't actually doing anything. I took the instrumentation and packed it up as best as I could and carried it out to the streets outside. And I found these real spikes of air pollution being caused by my neighbour's wood burning, which was drifting, pardon me, into my home. You can also see there's lots of other sources of indoor air pollution, such as when I caught fire to the oil in the frying pan when I cooked my tea a little bit later. But the important point I'd like to show here is that, you know, there is indoor impacts of air pollution in the homes of the people that are burning wood, and also in the homes of their neighbours as well. If I could have the next slide, please. So this really asks the question, if I was to, you know, I think if I was to pick almost any of you or the average person on the street and ask them where's air pollution worst, they would probably spend about 30 seconds and point to the nearest bit of really trafficked, busy, dieselized, you know, road. And that's where we do a lot of our measurements. But it raises an interesting question. With solid fuel, are we creating new air pollution hotspots that, if you like, are below the radar, that we're not detecting with our measurement networks, mainly because we spend a lot of time measuring close to traffic rather than in suburban areas where people might be able to burn wood. This is a couple of experiments that we did in the first lockdown. This was a really difficult experiment, but we sent one of my colleagues. We just kind of knew that we were going to have to close the place, so we took some equipment and sent someone home with a load of it. And here he is trying to make measurements in his, I think it's in his kitchen, when his neighbours are burning wood outside. And you can see some really high concentrations of particle pollution that are just outside his window as his neighbours are burning wood. And if I could have the next slide, please. And this kind of fits with a lot of the anecdotal information. I mean, my inbox is completely full of people that write to me. Generally, the people that write to me are those that are caring for someone else. They're either caring for an asthmatic child or they're caring for an elderly person, maybe who has COPD. And their child or elderly person's bedroom is being filled with the smell of wood smoke from their neighbours quite regularly, and they're very concerned. So, if you like, we were going out to investigate these. So what we did is we set up a load of equipment that could be worn. And these are my colleagues, Andrew and John, walking the streets of London, measuring air pollution as they do so. If I could have the next slide, please. The first study we did on this was up in Islington. And it was done by Andrew there using the kit that he took home during lockdown. And we set him off on walks around his neighbourhood. And you can see the time series of the concentrations that he measured there on these two graphs. And both of these graphs show a distinct spike. And when we actually began to map out the locations of when he was detecting these spikes, they all started to drop together into a small number of locations. If I could do the next slide, please. So on the right-hand side, you can see a heat map of the concentrations that he was breathing as he went round. And you're welcome to look at this in more detail in the slide pack from home. One area that I would point out to is over here, this area A, and this was where the majority of these large spikes were encountered each time it came past. And we did a bit of detective work, and we found this sports pavilion with this actually quite modern wood chip or wood pellet burner that had been installed in there for reasons of climate neutrality. And it was producing a lot of air pollution that could be measured for tens or 100 odd meters away across the park and into the neighboring houses. So that was one air pollution hotspot that we definitely discovered. We discovered other ones on the residential streets. If I could have the next slide, please. One of the other things as well is that we have this question really is when we go out and encounter these, are these really transient spikes, or do we have in London something that's quite diffuse wood burning that just varies from location to location? On the right-hand side, you can see some communities elsewhere in the world where it looks like that the variation in the scale and the magnitude of the wood burning is not on a sort of, house by house basis, but is on a street by street or neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And we've got some evidence in London for that. Around 2010, I laid out a transect 34 kilometres long, stretching from east to west London, which is shown in that. And we noticed greatest concentrations of wood burning were in the suburban areas and less in the centre, and the difference was about 20%. So if I can have the next slide, please. Our paradigm now for trying to investigate these hotspots is to actually try to capture both, rather than walking intensely around a small neighbourhood where maybe the concentrations are quite elevated uniformly. We're actually trying to walk transects now. So a project that we have for 19 of the London boroughs at the moment, we're walking several transects. One of them is an example here, runs Wimbledon to Battersea. So it takes about 2.5 hours to be walked and covers a fair distance. And you can see there on the timelines information as our walker has encountered things. And each of the green comments are when the walker, because they can't see the measurements as they go, the walker encounters quite blindly smells of wood burning. And then we process the data later. And you can see there's these spikes of particle pollution. And down here in the blue, we have a metric that's an indicator of whether it's wood burning or not. So you can see that many of these where our walker is smelling wood burning, they are seeing elevated concentrations, and our devices are more confirming that it is wood burning as well. So these spikes are out there. We just need to understand more about them, where they are and what their impacts are. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk. I can take this all the way back to 1952. Part of the solution to, when government was dragged reluctantly to pass the Clean Air Act in 1956, they declared smoke control areas, and the whole of London subsequently becomes one. Yeah, and as does most of the large urban areas in the UK. So in a smoke control area, you're not permitted to, it has a strange way of setting something to do with the type of fuel that you're allowed to use, matching it to the appliance in which you burn it, which the officers can probably explain a lot better than I can. But the bottom line is, if you're living in London, it is illegal under this to burn wood in an open fire. If you burn wood, it has to be in a DEF-approved appliance for the burning of wood. Yeah. If we actually look at the data here, this comes from the DEFRA survey, and you can see the proportion of homes that are using open fires in the second line. And it really stands out in London. The average in London here is 56% in the DEFRA survey, which is twice the value of anywhere else in Britain. Northern Ireland has its own issues, which we could talk about separately. So you can see that's around twice the average that's seen. There was an earlier survey in 2015 that also found London as a region that stood out from everywhere else in sort of mainland UK in terms of the proportion of open fires that were used. And really they shouldn't be. Unless you're burning a smokeless fuel in that open fire, then you're contravening the law. So that could be a good way in as a starting point. Next slide, please. So so this is all describing the problem, and what sort of solutions do we have? So I thought I'd have a quick run through what's been tried elsewhere and has it worked or not, yeah, internationally, because this is not a unique thing, these issues with wood burning. So I've got 2 slides that I'm going to canter my way through in terms of what's actually been done and how successful it's been. So we had a solid fuel burning problem in London all the way up to the 1950s. We declared smoke control areas. this really meant that you either had to change your appliance or you could only burn smokeless fuel. Really, at that time, it was astonishingly successful. The London local authorities rolled this out, and because of the 52 smog, they were the most enthusiastic adopters. Many other councils didn't actually take up their powers to the 1970s, but in London, it was rolled out as fast as possible. And we reduced particle pollution in London in a 10-year period by 75%. Now, this is the types of change that have been achieved in Beijing in, you know, in the last sort of 10-year period. And people look at what's been achieved in Beijing and they say, this is fantastic, but we could not do this with our political system because of the way Chinese society is organized. But we have done it, and it's been done before, and it was done in London in the 1950s. Massive cuts in particle pollution. However, as I've pointed out here, the legislation that brought that about is largely ignored. So nationally, 27% of homes that are within smoke control areas are still using open fires, and the figure for London is 56%. Smoky coal bans. These were started in Dublin in response, those old enough to remember the last energy crisis in the 1970s associated with oil will remember a lot of the concern at that time, and the response by the Irish government was to move back towards the encouragement of the burning of peat and solid fuels rather than oil to heat homes. And Dublin's air pollution deteriorated markedly through the 1990s. And then what they did was they introduced a ban on the sales of smoky coal, if you like. So similar to what we have in the UK, where you can only burn smokeless fuel. This was really dramatic. Air pollution in Dublin, particle pollution reduced by 70% in the space of one winter to the next. And it's one of the, you know, it's astounding. But when it comes to coal, most of the problems in the UK, or most people, 3/4 of the homes that are burning solid fuel in the UK, and especially those in urban areas, are not using coal. So we've tried that one. It's not really going to work that much again. Wet wood, the government has introduced a ban on the sale of wet wood in small quantities for people to use at home. Not been tried before, that one. Not much evidence really about how well that's going to work. We know from testing, you know, wet wood is a lot more smoky in a test situation than not. But how well that's going to work, I don't know. And especially it's up against it with the fact that only 20% of the wood that people are burning is actually, if you like, is sold as wet wood anyway. So they're only affecting a small part of the marketplace. Stove standards. We could improve the standards of the appliances and the ways in which people are burning their solid fuel. These have been tried before. We have stove standards that date back to the 1950s. There is eco-design standards, there's Clear Skies, there's Nordic Swan and all these other ones. And they should perform a lot better. And they do in tests. But what we find, certainly there's been some very large projects done in New Zealand whereby they actually climb up on people's chimneys and see what's actually coming out in a real world situation when people are burning wood. And they find that they produce a lot more pollution in the real world when they're given to real people trying to burn real fuels. And yeah, up to about 3 to 16 times greater than what happens in the regulatory tests. But also turnover's really slow. Over 60% of the stoves in England, and when it comes to London, because people are using the open fire that came with their house, over 90% of the people that burn in wood in London are doing it in something that's older than 10 years old. So if we're reliant on new appliances to come through, then it's going to be a really slow, way to affect the problem. And also those people that burn wood, invest in a new stove, burn more than people that don't. So it kind of offsets the benefit as well. If I can move on to the next slide, please. There's one more slide of things that have worked and things that haven't. Subsidies for new stoves. This is done a lot in the US, and there are several examples where whole communities, like mountain communities, especially the key one that's quoted a lot is that of Libby, Montana, where all of the stoves were upgraded. And this was reasonably effective in reducing air pollution in this community by about 27%. And when it comes to the health impacts, there's some really nice evidence from these types of studies that reducing air pollution and reducing the wood burning actually improved health. So there was less wheeze reported in the children after all the stoves were upgraded. So they reduced the pollution by 27%, less wheeze in children. And there's been some similar results from the Rhone Valley, not on the kids, but on in terms of the reduction that can be achieved. But if you remember those clouds that were coming out on that diagram before, we should be achieving a far greater benefit than 27%. So something's not working. Perhaps the most successful ways have been practiced in the US, in Launceston, which is in Tasmania. They actually paid people to have their wood burning stoves ripped out and to heat their homes with electricity. This was really successful. So the amount of homes that burnt wood dropped from 66 to 30%. Particle pollution dropped by about 40%. And this was actually measured, had a measurable effect in death rates in the community. So they compared Launceston with Hobart, which is a similar sized town up the road that didn't have this intervention. And they found that there was actually improvements within death rates in the intervention area where they'd done this compared to up the road where they haven't. Wood burning bans, burn bans, these have been practiced a lot in the US. They're very popular in the western parts of the US, Puget Sound area especially. And what they say is when air pollution is forecast to be bad, you cannot use wood to heat your home unless it's your only form of heating. And they have people from the local authority out there with thermal imaging guns looking at people's chimneys to find out what they're burning and how they're doing so, and people get fined for doing so. These have some degree of success. They're certainly really good at raising public awareness of the problem. There can be some reductions in air pollution. There was one scheme that ended up calling burn bans on, I think, 150 days through one winter time, which is pretty much all of winter. And many people then just gave up wood burning completely as a heating source. And that was very successful. We saw a reduction, or the researchers saw a reduction in hospital admissions in that California community that did that. So the other one is behavioral changes. And, you know, this is where we have to be really smart, and us as a science community have to learn, for those of you that are fronting the public every day, which is, you know, those of you that are elected here and those of you that are officers. And is there a scope for much more nuanced and much more intelligent information campaigns? Like, for instance, several councils, I don't know if you were one, requested people during lockdown to not burn wood or to ban bonfires because there was people who would be in their own homes, be it shielding or perhaps ill, who would be very vulnerable from the combination of COVID or the risks of COVID, and air pollution would be exacerbating this. The best campaign is run, I think, by Environment Canterbury, which covers the area around Christchurch and South Island, New Zealand. If I could have the next slide. And here what they do is they kind of play into a lot of different narratives rather than just tell people about things. They try to play a sort of almost machismo thing about how good your wood burning technique is, and try to get people to invest in learning how to do it better and being able to do it better than their neighbors. There's other things about smoky-free burning, getting your stove or your fireplace to work properly means that you're wasting less fuel and you'll have a much more cozy nest. They do a lot of work around kindling to making sure that people lighten their fires better, giving out free kindling, giving out tools to help people make kindling without chopping their fingers off. So there's lots of interesting interventions from that rather than, you know, just telling people about these things. Next slide, please. So I'm conscious I've been talking for some time. Wood burning is not carbon neutral. We really, really have to remember this, and this plays so much to the next presentations that are coming up on climate. This comes from so-called the kind of like wood burning counterfactual. So you think of two situations. Situation one, you chop down the tree and burn it instead of using a fossil fuel. Situation two, you leave the tree in the forest, absorbing carbon, and burn the fossil fuel instead. Now, burning wood for the same amount of heat produces more carbon at the time of burning than burning coal. Yeah, so you have an evening in front of your fire, not that any of you do, but have an evening in front of your fire, and for the same amount of heat, there will be more carbon in the air at the end of that evening than there would be had you used a fossil fuel to heat your home in the same way. And the carbon neutrality of wood burning relies on the forest regrowth. So how long does that take for this tree that's been chopped down, or this stand of trees, to then reabsorb the carbon? Studies have been done not on the real industrial scale, wood harvesting. And there's a whole set of graphs here that mark black, yellow, and green. And the top one that's all black shows the kind of the carbon deficit from cutting down mature trees for 120 years old. And it doesn't become carbon neutral for a period of at least 100 years. Now, if you chop down younger trees, or if you use salvage wood, then that is better, yeah, and that the payback time is better. But going down chopping mature trees, we're going to have more carbon in the atmosphere for perhaps a century or so. And that's really important with climate tipping points. It's really important in the UK when we think about where is all our wood coming from and what's that doing for the biodiversity of our woodlands. There's one study in France that said, how can we produce more French-grown wood to feed our wood burning habit? And they could find no way that actually didn't damage the carbon stocks of their forests. So you either go out and find old woodland that's really maturing and full of biodiversity and chop that down, or you take forests and chop them down before they're fully grown. Either way, increasing the amount of wood that you source from France, and the UK is quite similar, will be a carbon problem. It will increase the amount of carbon that's in the air and reduce that's in the ecosystems. So next slide. You can go and have a look at all these papers later on. So I'm going to bring this to a close. I'm sorry I've spoken for some time, but one of the overall messages here is that all the time with air pollution, we're focused on one source at a time, and we really need to think about this in a holistic way. We've been focusing so much on transport, and solid fuel burning has come along and almost bit us in the bum, and it's become a problem. The other problems we have at the moment are that we really need to focus on it. So we need to focus on all of these things, not just on wood burning. We need to be focusing on things like agriculture, which is a tremendous problem for the whole of Western Europe and air pollution. The products that we're now using in our homes, from everything from your printer to personal care products, containing chemicals that produce summertime air pollution, tire and brake wear, to name just a few. So there's a lot of sources. It's not just about wood burn. It's not about transport. Next, please. One of the other things, just bringing it to our colleagues who are going to present on climate, is that many of the things that we've done for climate have actually been pretty adverse for air pollution so far. We think about the dieselization of our vehicle fleets done in, supposedly for climate benefit. I think you would argue, there's good evidence that it had no climate benefit. And that was a disaster for air pollution. So my late colleague, Martin Williams, was at a meal some time back and basically sketched out this little 2x2 on a napkin, which he then went and wrote a scientific paper about. And so you've got one axis, the vertical axis of things that are air pollution benefit. So things that are good for air pollution are vertically up. And for climate, we have those that are good for climate change that are running towards the right-hand side. And you can see there are trade-offs against all of these. And what we really need is policies that hit that sweet spot that are both better for air pollution and better for climate. So things like solar power, electric vehicles, heat pumps, active travel, home insulation, rather than biomass burning, urban CHP, dieselisation, for instance. So next slide. I'd like to take it a bit further, actually, and we're all doing this air pollution lark really for health reasons, the health of the population. So I'm really, really, really bad at graphics, but just imagine along with me a third axis here, if you just will. And this third axis is health, and somehow it's coming out of the page, yeah? So we could split the things that we could do for air pollution and climate according to a health axis as well. So undoubtedly, you know, we could electrify our vehicle fleet, or we could encourage active travel. And the benefits from the active travel are, the co-benefits are just hugely better than we would get from the electric vehicles alone. We could go and fit heat pumps to people's homes, or we could insulate them and perhaps alleviate some of the issues of poor housing quality and fuel poverty at the same time. So there's a lot of things here that we really need to optimize on all three of these axes. And so that's nearly my final point. It's my nearly segue over to the climate change people. But next slide. Yeah, so I tried to put this all together. We've got a colleague called Alice who works at Southampton on the Clean Air Programme, and she's tried to draw this in this sort of like Venn diagram of good things in the middle there, and you can see a few. But next one. So I think it's always, a lot of these air pollution presentations are doom and gloom. And I think you as elected leaders, and perhaps we as scientists, officers and members of the public, we must help people think about what thing the future might be in a positive way. And we're not going to get there if we just frame air pollution as being a problem all of the time. We've got to help people envisage solutions and help them think how they will be better. So these are pictures of what I would think of low carbon, smog-free, socially inclusive, biodiverse, healthy cities. And all of these places exist in the UK today, which could be models of things that we could do. And I think really it's summed up. I'm not sure you can all see, but that lad who's sitting there on his space hopper in a school street somewhere in London is beaming from ear to ear. He's the happiest lad to be out there in that road space and playing. So next slide, I think we're just about at the end now. Yeah, so that's the end. So those are my contact details. And if you're interested, I've written a book, which is about £8.36 from Waterstones. So if you'd like to go and buy a copy, then feel absolutely free to do so. There's some other slides there on air pollution issues in case people ask questions on the rest of the pack. But that's me, I'm done now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Gary Fuller. That was fantastic. I think everyone will agree. It was really broad and took on a lot of the issues that we've been thinking about. I think first I'll go to the committee and see if you've got any comments or questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fuller, for a fantastic presentation. I have a few questions, if you don't mind. So first of all, do you have a figure for the percentage of households in Hammersmith and Fulham that have wood burners or use wood as a source of fuel, by any chance?
No, we don't. The DEFRA survey, which is our best source of information, was on a regional basis and treated London as a lump. We do have some projections within the London atmospheric emissions inventory. So what we do is we to create that, we measure air pollution and then we work backwards to say, well, from wood burning, what emissions would have to have happened for us to get that measurement. And then what we do is we spatially try to spread this out around London. But our main surrogate for doing this is housing type and housing density. So, for instance, you know, tall blocks of flats, they have no chimneys. So it's not going to be there. So it's going to be mainly, you know, in houses built up until the 1960s. So that's what we're using as our surrogate. So that means that the problems are largely in the houses that were built with chimneys and in the most densely packed areas. There are data available in the atmospheric emissions inventory which your environmental health colleagues should be able to access.
Thank you. With regards to the low emission zone slide, would you by any chance have any high level data on what impact it's had? So what the percentage reduction in air pollution has been for London?
Did I have a next slide along here with the LEZ in? It's Rob, isn't it? If you could just go through a couple of slides, because I don't. If you just go on to the next one, I can't remember if I included a low emissions zone slide. Was it in the pack I was showing already? No, next one. Next one.
It was earlier.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Did I have a low emission zone slide? I took my way through. Anyway, the low emission zone, ultra low emission zone, when it was introduced in the central area, was highly successful, and we looked at air pollution alongside roads, and most especially nitrogen dioxide in the central area. And I've got my wood burning head on, so the numbers aren't entirely in my head. But if I recall correctly, there was about a 40% reduction as vehicles were upgraded in the time ahead of the scheme, because if you like, the impacts don't happen like snap on the start of charging. And there's been further benefits since that time. Some of these benefits in the central area may seem to be disappearing as traffic's coming back into the central area. One of the important things we did in our analysis is, the analysis was done by the GLA, but I was, if you like, a reviewer to different components of that and looked at the methodology. So the methodology that was used included a counterfactual, because vehicles get new all the time anyway, yeah? People upgrade, what would happen without the ULEZ? So we included a counterfactual in there. So if you look at the graphs in the report, they're all done against what we think would have happened without the ULEZ. And for that, for the central area, what we did was the rate of change that happened in outer London. The ULEZ was then expanded, of course, to the north and south circulars, covering the areas here. And the benefit that then came from that against this, what we think would have been a no ULEZ scenario, is about 20% reduction off the top of my head in nitrogen dioxide concentrations. So in terms of tackling nitrogen dioxide next to roads, it's been highly effective. I've been measuring air pollution for 30 years, and I struggle to think of anything that's been as effective as the central London ULEZ was.
Thank you very much. Just one final question, if I may, Chair. You mentioned something very important in your presentation, the asthmatics. Do we as a borough by any chance keep a tally of percentage of asthmatics and correlate that to the levels of air pollution in our borough?
I'm not sure that's one I can necessarily answer. There have been quite a few studies of asthmatics and air pollution. I think the consensus will be that children are much more susceptible to air pollution. Well, it's thought that air pollution, the evidence base, if we look at where they've been reviewed from a whole international sets of studies, seems to suggest that air pollution is associated with first onset of asthma, and the exacerbations that are seen in children are sort of greater than those that are seen in adults. But there is work that has been done by my colleagues, which would have estimated the asthma burden, I think, on a borough by borough basis. But I can try and dig out that report. If I funnel them through you as chair?
Yeah.
I'll see if that data is in the report I'm thinking of.
Yes, you were speaking to me earlier about an internal in people's homes survey that the Imperial are doing with 100 homes in the W12 area. I don't know if you want to tell the committee a little bit about that.
Yes, we're interested very much in, if you like, the whole exposure that people have, since we also, we spend a lot of our time indoors. We're not just exposed to air pollution outdoors. we spend our time in transport microenvironments, be it on the bus or, you know, kids at school. And we have a large program at the moment that's reaching out to around 100 homes in the area around White City, where we're going out doing really quite in-depth investigations of the air pollution in people's homes. And the aim there is to try to recruit homes where there's children with asthma. So that's ongoing at the moment. I think we're not quite, if I remember correctly, we're not quite halfway with having reached out to homes yet.
We could also direct that question to probably Councillor Coleman, who on the health side of things might have more information about the prevalence of asthma in young people, particularly in the borough. We can find that out.
There's been some.
Would you like to speak? Oh, sorry. Could I ask you to come here, just because the people at home who might watch it on YouTube won't be able to hear you, but also could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Caroline Kelly. I'm a constituent in this borough, and I'm also born and bred. And my son had asthma, and I did a study on air pollution 30 years ago, and it's not correlatable because it's dependent on the change in the pollution. So hence, it doesn't matter how much pollution my son was sitting in. If it wasn't new to him, it wouldn't aggravate his asthma.
Okay, I think
It's the
take
change
that on board. Yeah, I think
so. So you can't. So basically, you can't. It doesn't work whereby you've got a number of children with asthma and pollution, and you can correlate it. It's how new that pollution is. So it's the rise. It's the change in the pollution that aggravates asthma.
Thank you for
not the
that.
actual pollution.
I think actually the point Dr. Fuller made earlier, when there was an actual change in the 1956 law that showed a lot of change in the atmosphere, it'd be interesting to look at whether asthma went down in that occasion. So we might do a little bit of research into asthma, but I think we need to approach the health team rather than do it ourselves.
Yeah,
but
basically, it's the change. It's the change.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Now,
I put in with just one response. It's been an interesting study that's been done, if I remember correctly, in Southwark and Lambeth, where it's so hard to detect people's individual asthma from, you know, let's say health statistics, because we don't know how people are suffering on a day-to-day basis until they get sufficiently bad such that they come to their doctor or they end up in hospital. So we may be missing a lot of the underlying sort of chronic asthma things. But there's been some really nice work done in Southwark and Lambeth, where they've looked at prescription rates. So whether people have come back to their doctors for inhaler prescriptions or they're using them faster, and they've associated
Again, that
with
wouldn't give an
exposure.
accurate, because people are told to use those inhalers. They're told to
Yes.
use them and stay on them. So that wouldn't.
No,
give
I realise, but there's people have a preventer and a reliever generally. So you can look at the use of people's relievers. The paper's really
It
worth
wouldn't
having a
be-
look
yeah,
at.
That wouldn't be accurate, because people are told to use that.
thank you.
Something,
Yeah,
is it?
I think, thank you very much. Now, could I move on to committee members?
Yes, thank
Councillor
you.
Laura James.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much in particular for including solutions, because as you say, at this committee, we often hear about how terrible things are, but solutions are absolutely critical. And I just was interested in what you were saying about the Clean Air Act and the impact that made. But also just looking at the DEFRA website, can see that their penalties for using open fires in a smoke controlled area. Is there any research to your knowledge about how often these fines are used, where they're used, basically enforcement? Because obviously if things are unlawful but then they're not caught, then it's not effective.
There are almost no fines. The total, I don't know, you would have to ask your own officers whether there have been any fines in the borough, let's say in the last 10 years.
And I suppose
Nationally, we're talking, I did a a study's been published out of Nottingham. Well, I don't have the figures in my head, but very few local authorities have taken any enforcement action against people. I think Camden has done so in London, and that was quite a standout. It's taken a couple of cases, but I mean, officers, you don't have to necessarily enforce something for it to be effective. You know, fining people through the court system is very time consuming in terms of officers and stressful in terms of the people concerned. But having that there as, you know, like a backstop, if you like, that can support communication, I think is very, very valuable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Just a quick one.
Councillor-
Just thank you so much. I loved it. And, you know, I think the hardest thing, what we've all got to think about is getting the message out to everybody that it's a bad move to burn wood at the end of the day, isn't it? So how, I guess, I don't know how we do it, but how can we incentivize people? I suppose that's our next step, isn't it? And are there any boroughs that or areas that are good examples who have started this process?
That's why I threw on it's an excellent question. And we need really to engage behavioural scientists. And, you know, if you were to ask me, I'd just wheel out the boss, you know, he's got a big professor title. And he'll say, wood burning's bad for you. I've told you now, and that's the last we hear of the matter. Thank you very much. But people don't behave in that way. And, you know, there's a whole decades worth of behavioural scientists that, you know, have earned Nobel Prizes from these types of things. And we need to talk to them. And it's about breaking down barriers to change and identifying and breaking those down rather than just giving out types of information, which is why I put on the Environment Canterbury stuff from New Zealand, since I think that was about the most creative and best campaign I'd seen, actually going out and trying to almost gamify this, trying to get you thinking the pride that people have in burning a good fire and feeding into that, as well as things to do with kindling, giving out free kindling so people can see the difference it makes in fire lighting.
I'm just interested, what is good kindling? I mean,
Good kindling.
What-
Well, it depends a lot on your stove and how you actually, you know, burn your wood. But their findings were that a lot of people produced a lot of pollution at the start of their wood burning because they weren't using enough kindling to get their fire going quickly. Now, one of the downsides of this is that a low polluting fire will burn through your fuel, your wood really quickly and produce loads of heat. And the problem is most people are burning for aesthetic reasons. So they don't want to burn through all their wood in a nice, efficient way. They want to have something that's, you know, slumbering away and looking lovely in the fireplace. But really, I think if we're going to move forward on this, we really need to talk to behavioural scientists.
Yeah, I think
on board. Councillor James, you mentioned about how many fines have been issued, and I wouldn't defend, you know, the Clean Air Acts have really fallen into abeyance. That's the bottom conclusion from this. And I don't think you can judge that through the percentage of fines. You just have to judge it by the proportion of people using open fires in London to realise the extent of the problem and to which that, you know, that whole legal system just isn't really fit for the current purpose.
I think we need to get the message out in schools as well. The younger generation bring it home, don't they?
We're going to move on to engagement in a minute, but I was just going to go back actually to the challenge of the fact that these are in people's homes. Yeah. So it's actually a little bit more difficult to legislate to enact those fines if it's in people's homes, and you would literally have to knock on doors to see what they were burning. So I think the challenge is to kind of work out who is burning and what they're burning. With the DEFRA 50,000 survey from a few years ago, you know, did you do that was the survey, how can you put it? Was it quite neutral in tone? Because it's quite, sorry, I'm just trying to think of the word. As you said, it's quite an aesthetic thing. People, it's an emotional thing in their homes to have a gathering around the fire. So in order to do these surveys and get honest answers, I'd imagine the wording and the questions would have to be fairly neutral. But do you have an opinion on that?
They went out to Kantar, who did this and do this professionally. So, you know, if you like, the objectives were set and they framed the questions in the way that they do from the surveying that they've done. There was, if I remember correctly, there's 3 different types of engagement. There was focus groups. There was some in-depth interviews with people, and then they sampled weekly through the course of a year through telephone surveys to find out what people had done in the last week. So a lot of the questions were not so much opinion questions, but were factually, you know, so have you burnt wood in your home in the last week? Yes, no. If so, how much wood have you burnt? What's your fireplace look like? How old is it? Those types of questions. So they weren't so much opinion type questions. They were just trying to get sort of quantified data.
Thank you for that. I mean, even just asking the question brings people's focus onto the issue. So I think that's really quite interesting. Councillor Melton, did you want to ask anything?
Yeah, I'd like to really echo thanks. For your very comprehensive summary. I just want to pick up, particularly on the solution point already raised by Ecology, to make sure I've fully understood. Remembering your diagram with your 3 axes, which was a kind of big long-term vision. Am I correct in understanding that the bigger weather changing policy solutions around insulation, planning, reshaping our transport system, big issues, sadly, beyond the power of this council today. But I'm keen to zero in on the opportunities that the council can take in the immediate term. And am I correct in understanding that you identified 4 the kind of enhancing the enforcement of the London smoke control ban? Leading by example, so kind of cancelling our kind of wood burning events, things like bonfire, that's that kind of thing. The creative public information campaigns, like the example, and then campaigning for national regulatory check. Can you confirm that those are I've understood correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't being so explicit as you're laying out in terms of recommendations in that way. Certainly there is a problem with smoke control, the way it's framed at the moment. There is, you know, there has been, I don't know, I struggle very much as a scientist from telling, if you like, you as what elected representatives you should do, or what members of the public should do. And I think I lay out the evidence and I leave it for your interpretation as to what ways forward. But yes, it's certainly very sensible to be doing stuff around the enforcement of, well, not necessarily enforcement, education, awareness, and doing things within the existing framework of that we have, the legal framework around smoke control. And there's some good examples of behavioural change interventions that haven't really been tried in the UK. In terms of cancelling things to do with bonfires and other events like that, I think also you've got to look, would it be sad to do so? You know, events like that, we need to be looking very carefully at what example is given through those. We need also to be taking care of the people that go to these events if they're asthmatic, they're upwind of them and so forth. But I'm not saying that we should necessarily ban anything. I'm just putting out the evidence there, really. And I'm looking for you to come back to me with the things that you think are in your domain that you might be able to, based on this evidence, that you might be able to get to work.
So if I understood correctly, as a scientist, The four that I've outlined, you have seen being deployed elsewhere by other.
Tell me your four again.
So I have enforcement, leading by example, creative public information campaigns, and campaigning for national regulatory change.
Yeah, all of those would be things that would certainly help. Yeah, you couldn't really disagree with those. How much we need to be changing the narrative here. You know, wood burning, it's seen as carbon neutral. And people struggle to believe that it's actually polluting because wood is a natural product. And I think really just starting to change this narrative is very, very important. And we're not really getting that at the moment. Some of the actions from government around things like wet wood sales. I've seen, for instance, a lot of writing in these, you know, Look at My Lovely Home magazines, where people have interpreted this, that it's okay to continue to burn wood, providing they're burning dry wood, and they can throw a dry log on the fire and sit there with a clear conscience. And we really have to change this narrative. Big overall message. I think the big one that you have to get out there is burning solid fuels is the most polluting way to heat your home.
Yes.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. So turning to officers, I mean, we're going to move on to the engagement shortly because we don't have a lot of time. But I think we're going to take that on board with the engagement, that one of them is that we need to get the message out, but also possibly over to speaking to officers, we need to know who we're speaking to, because there's good information, but a lot of it is hypothesizing that it is sort of the AB middle classes that are invested in stoves, that are burning open fires in older built houses that we need to be targeting, and how we target that message to those particular people. So I think that will be the officer's job here. But I'll just quickly see if I need to take questions from the public, but we will have an engagement section and communications. So, and we'll try and do a Q&A after that as well. But does anyone have anything they'd like to say now?
That one, sorry. I'm Helen Dell, the Borough's Climate Change Commissioner, and just wanted to add our thanks for that excellent presentation. It was illuminating. What I just wanted to clarify was your comments about the statistics, because you were saying at the beginning that 8% of people in the UK have wood burning stoves, and that contributes to, solid fuel burning, that contributes to more than all the vehicles on the road. If we just home into London and Hammersmith, you then went on later to say that I think 17% of primary PM 2.5 came from the solid fuel source. But in terms of air quality in London, or air quality even in Hammersmith and Fulham, maybe London's easier one, the other, how much comes from solid fuel burning as against transport or other things? Yeah. Just broadly speaking.
We have the same situation in London, where we look at the particle pollution that arises in London, and, you know, wood burning is a massive source compared to the other ones. We have a lot more transport than other parts of the country.
Yes.
With particle pollution, we also have to remember the particles that are emitted travel a very long way.
Yes.
So I'm talking about the pollution that's emitted within London. What we also breathe in London is the air pollution that's been emitted in other places as well. So if you like, the air that we breathe in London today, yesterday, it could be in Paris, tomorrow it could be in Newcastle or Amsterdam, and it will carry a lot of that air pollution burden with it. So the proportion of the particles that you breathe that come from wood burning is a lot lower, because we're getting you know, an input from the outside. and that's around about, I think about 7 or 8%. But it is still a very large source that we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. So obviously we have a very big
And
emphasis.
And I worry a lot as well about the localized effects, you know, the
Yes.
kind of general averaged over London. So how much are we seeing in terms of hotspots
Yeah,
whereby people might be persistently exposed through the winter
yeah.
to their neighbours' wood burning? And to be honest, we don't know a vast amount about that. And that's why we're sending people out walking around London to try and see whether that hypothesis that there is these hotspots is actually borne out in evidence.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Because we obviously in this borough have a real focus on clean air mitigation measures and clean air neighbourhoods and so on. So I just wanted to understand the statistics there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Councillor James would like to come in, but was there another question from the floor? I'll take the gentleman first because he hasn't spoken, but could you introduce yourself and put your question?
Hello, Wilf McDonald Brown, resident in the borough. Can I just check one thing, Dr. Fuller? The difference between internal combustion engine cars and electric cars in terms of pollution. Because am I right in thinking that the particulates are just as much, if not, in fact, more of a problem with electric cars because they do come from the tyres and the brake discs, not from the exhaust. Is that correct? Am I understanding that right?
It's really interesting, and you raise a really interesting point. Electric vehicles that we have today tend to be heavier than their combustion engine equivalents. And we have over the last decade invested a great deal in the abatement of exhaust emissions. Yeah. So if we put together the fact that electric vehicles are at the moment heavier, then you can get scenarios where you could calculate that the particle emission from electric vehicles is greater than that from internal combustion ones. It's not necessarily so much from brakes, but it's more from tyre wear and the road wear that they create. But if we look at the future, there is tremendous effort being done to, I can't remember the industry phrase, but it's basically make electric vehicles lighter. So they will become lighter. There is also some stuff around driver behaviour. So people that have electric vehicles, once they're used to them, there's one study that springs to mind that say that people drive in a much smoother way in order to be able. Interesting. When they first get their electric vehicles, has anyone driven an electric vehicle?
Sorry, can I interrupt because we are pushed for time this evening, and this is brilliant and it's fascinating. But I'd like to bring it back to wood burning because we have got clean air neighbourhoods, and we have moved to a 20 mile per hour on all the roads that we control. So we are working on transport and traffic mitigation in other ways. So I really appreciate your question.
Sure, but it was the follow-up was, I mean,
okay.
It is difficult, as has already been discussed, to police people's use of wood burning stoves, etc. I appreciate that. Although I do think fines would work. But I also think we're getting mixed messages from the council in terms of your transport policies, because after all, you have frozen the residents' car permit for, I think, 8 years in a row now. It's one of, if not the cheapest borough for that. You reversed the raise in parking fees recently. There's a loophole that means you can have as many cars as you want registered in a household as long as they're under different owners. My point is that these things which are very easy to control and which would help with the cleaner. Oh, and school streets, the picture of the boy on the space hopper couldn't happen in our borough because we don't uniquely now in inner London have any school streets as such. So I think you as the council have a lot to do with those levers that you can very easily pull. So yes. I would call on you as a resident to do your bit.
I completely understand that. We do have the clean air neighbourhoods that is rolling out, and I do know the relationship between the school streets and the clean air neighbourhoods isn't clear, but we've got a bigger ambition than just the air around schools. The council's ambition is to have cleaner air throughout the borough and not just around schools, because of the many arguments we have about the way traffic works. But tonight we are talking about wood burners because we have Dr. Fuller here, who has given us brilliant percentages and research that shows that there is a huge save to be made if we can look at wood burning and solid fuel burning as well as transport. It doesn't, it's not instead of.
No, of course not.
Tonight
I'm well aware of that.
Yeah, no, we did clean air neighbourhoods back in January, and we will keep doing it.
Okay, but in which case I want to keep giving you the message that you're not doing well enough.
Thank you. We will continue. Thank you very much. Now we've got very little time. Can I ask for the presentation, and then we bring all the questions in at the end, because this is an engagement, and I think that would be coming really useful with attacking the wood burning issue. Could I have Mark? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Mark Tomlinson. I'm Climate Engagement and Behaviour Change Lead. And hopefully, if the tech is all good, we would like, with your leave, to start with a little video, if that's okay. I'm from Hammersmith and Fulham Council. So yes, this presentation will be about communications and engagement. We would like to start with a little introduction, hopefully.
The UN reports that we must take radical action by 2030 to keep climate change within safe levels. That's why Hammersmith and Fulham Council has declared a climate and ecological emergency.
Climate emergency is our issue, and we will work with you to do everything we can to fix it.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think
it's more than words.
Do we stop it, Rob? Do we know what's happening? Can we work out why it's not showing? Thank you.
We could, maybe given the shortness of time, go into the rest of the presentation. I think probably makes sense at the moment. So I think Rob will continue later.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a link in the slide pack for those who wish to watch the video, which is just a lovely introduction to the topic. So what we see in the video is a diversity of residents and businesses taking climate action. And what this presentation is about is what is our role as a local authority, working with them and enabling them, inspiring them to take their own action. And to sort of center all of this, the slide you should be able to see now is the climate and ecology strategy in a page. The pink part at the top is the what we want to do. But today we're talking in the bottom section about the how, so engagement and influence. And that's what the rest of the session should be about. To set some context, why do we need to talk about engagement and influence? As Hammersmith and Fulham Council, we have direct control over only 8% of emissions in the borough, with potentially another 28% of emissions being something we can influence. That would be through things like planning policy, our own procurement, how the roads are used, that sort of thing. But even if you add all of those together, then you still have a majority of emissions at the source of them being residents and businesses and schools and so on. So for a bit more context, the writing, it shows that the main sources of emissions in the borough are from gas boilers, is the single biggest source of emissions. Then we have transport, and then lumping together, the third biggest source would be consumption. So that's the things that we buy, the things that we eat, that sort of thing. What you can see in the picture on the right is sort of a visual representation of that. Important to think, though, that these are averages. So you'll have many citizens who have a smaller footprint than this. That's about 8.8 tons. And then you'll have some residents who have a considerably larger footprint than this. We need to bring all of this down to net zero. And for a final bit of context, we can do that in different ways. Some of this will be through influencing people's behaviors, and others through persuading them to adopt certain technologies. In the chart, if you can see it, give some illustrations of how that might be done. For example, if you invest in a heat pump, that's a very considerable reduction in emissions. That's the orange box. And other changes, for example, through diet or how much you drive, will also reduce the number of emissions that as an individual you're responsible for. There are other things such as we have to do as a local authority and government, but as individuals, those are certain things that you can do. The good news is if we look at people's perceptions towards climate change, then this poll is from London councils in 2021. It shows an overwhelming percentage of people in London are somewhat or very concerned about climate change. The stated motivation to help prevent climate change, it's again, very overwhelming figures of people who say that they are somewhat or very motivated to prevent climate change. And then even on the international scale, Britain comes pretty much at the top of people. This is from UNDP. We're in a pretty uniquely advantageous situation in terms of attitudes towards something needing to be done. So that's the good news. However, if we look at the data, we see that trends are not aligned with this. So as much as people might have a compassion for the bees and wanting to see birds in their gardens, about almost a third of gardens in Hammersmith and Fulham are completely without vegetation, meaning the birds have no food. As another example, over a third of car trips in London are less than 2 kilometers. That's the sort of distance that, if you're physically able to, are quite easy to walk or cycle. Or as another example, meat consumption is declining a little bit, but not as much as scientists say would be necessary or compatible rather with a net zero environment. So these differences between people's attitudes and their behavior is appropriately called the attitude behavior gap. And this is where we might want to consider what our role is in this situation. And we would see it as enabling people to live climate-friendly lifestyles, removing barriers. And actually a lot of what we've heard in the air pollution talk is people often might have some awareness of what they need to do, but for some reason they're not. So this is sort of the Climate Action Together logo that many people might be familiar with, which tries to bring together this idea that this is something to be done across all sectors of society. It's not only Hammersmith and Fulham Council, it's not only businesses, or it's not only individuals, it's everyone working in partnership. What does that mean? What does it mean when we're talking about enabling climate-friendly behaviors? Well, our approach is about inspiring climate action, removing the barriers. So in the picture on the right, this is a monthly repair workshop at the Levat Centre, where we're funding sessions where people can either bring electricals to be repaired or can learn how to do it themselves. Listening to underrepresented voices so that we're engaging on terms that people understand and are relevant to them. Collaborating with partners, that sort of force multiplier of, for example, working with academic institutions or businesses, and communicating clearly and informing. I'll go into a bit of depth on each of these. For us, it's not necessarily about what we're doing, but what people are already doing. There's a lot of community groups, individuals, streets who are already doing something. And what we are trying to do is to share their stories so that what's happening in one street can be learned and adopted by people in another street or in another estate. So you're sort of revealing the world of the possible. It's also linked to this about nourishing networks that exist. about connecting people together who are interested but just need a little bit of information or a nudge. And linked to all of this is a small program we have called Climate Action Micro Grants. And these are small amounts of money that a community group could ask for to help them get going with a project. So you can see in the pictures in the bottom left, a food waste, a hot composter from a group in White City, where they cook a hot meal every Saturday for people who need it. And they now compost their waste in this hot composter. And they've also started to invite local residents also to bring their food waste in. And it gets a conversation going, and people are interested, they want to copy in their own areas or their own neighborhoods. In the middle picture, and I'm a bit aware of time, but in the middle picture, through one of these micro grants, a group paid for the repair of a set of sewing machines that had been donated. They now, every 2 weeks, have a session where they will have an expert teaching people how to repair their clothes or how to make new clothes. Again, this is sort of thinking about fast fashion and can we reuse rather than buying completely new things with all the resource implications that have. And maybe from another perspective, we have 3 tiny forests in the borough. These are sort of tennis court sized spaces with lots and lots of trees closely put together. Really great for wildlife, really great for getting people interested. It's very visual. And again, it's about sparking conversation. It's showing that, you know, all these various things are possible. Let's get on and do it. I won't talk about all of these pictures, but maybe pick out a couple. The top one with all the cycling, Hammersmith and Fulham has a very strong cycle training program. So again, this is about removing barriers to climate-friendly behavior. I think we recently confirmed that we have the biggest cycle training program in the country in secondary schools. The bottom right, maybe to pick out one last of these images, shows a number of organizations. And I think as a public authority, we have a convening power that can connect people together and lean on people's expertise, harness it, and reap the consequences. Not the consequences, the benefits, sorry. Right. Another of the areas that I mentioned was about collaboration. So businesses, we have something called the Climate Alliance, which has members across the borough who've all committed to taking climate action. That is a scheme that's about 1 year old. There are member forums for the organizations to share knowledge with each other, help them learn, help them plan. We also host lunch and learns where we present, where businesses present to each other. There's a climate action hub. This is a platform that connects businesses and community organizations. So businesses who want to participate, who want to do something on climate, but also feel that they are involved in the activities of the borough. There's a web platform where they can see what they can do. And most recently, we've been engaging, it's over 300 now, small and medium enterprises in the borough on a sort of individual basis to understand the cost of doing business. That's in the context of energy price spike. And in that context, we want to see what can we do that will not only help businesses in these times, but also help tackle climate change. Here are some of the members of the Climate Alliance. You'll see a mix of very big and very local businesses in this. We have also been running a pilot called Sustainability Champions over the past year that's targeting underrepresented voices, trying to identify what assets there are, what skills already exist in the borough. It's not about reinventing the wheel, but spinning it. And results from that will be with us quite soon. But we're also trying to ensure that our engagement is around people's real concern. So with Imperial College, we've been working with them and recently conducted a focus group with Somali residents in White City and Shepherd's Bush to make sure that we really understand what people's day-to-day concerns are, that we're not trying to foist messaging upon them that just rings hollow. And then we've also got upcoming some in-depth engagement on a fuel poverty strategy. And I think broadly would say that a lot of our communications has been around the cost of living crisis, because that's an urgent priority for people at the moment. When it comes to communicating and informing, we have a monthly series of climate cafes. So these are webinars on different topics. The one you can see in the slide was about cutting carbon with home retrofit. We have one next month about wildlife in the borough. It's a variety of themes that allow people to have the information that they need if they want to take action or just to keep them informed. We have climate literacy training. That's something we've built in-house. That's being rolled out among staff at the moment, but is also something we want to offer to groups who are using public money in some form or other, so resident involvement, investment groups, that sort of thing, something we want to offer. And on the right, you can see Climate Connects. This is our monthly newsletter with different themes, but it's showcases action happening in the borough, either from what Hammersmith and Fulham Council is doing or what community groups are doing, what businesses are doing. It's a way for people to remain engaged and informed. And we can see through the numbers of subscription that there's a very large or growing appetite for this sort of information, which is great to see. And so we're going to keep going. Why not? Thought might conclude with a little bit of discussion about how to communicate. And this touches a bit on the presentation we had before. And I think it's firstly important to recognize that the situation is pretty stark, but what is the best way of mobilizing action? There are different schools of thought. On the left, you can see one of the Extinction Rebellion protests. And it's certainly the case that a number of people are very strongly motivated by the gravity of the situation and will respond to the threat very rapidly and very closely. There's also academic research that is showing that more people respond to a different kind of messaging. So you might get 10 to 20% of people will respond to the starkness and sort of will be motivated by fear, for lack of another word. But there's also research showing that often people will switch off in that sort of situation. So if you talk about polar bears and the extinction of polar bears, people will feel they'll create a distance. They'll say that's far off, it doesn't affect me, or that flooding is in Bangladesh, and it's not an effective way to communicate with those people. Then there's another phenomenon called apocalypse fatigue. So people often read in the newspapers a lot of doom and gloom, and they hear, oh, everything's going to be terrible. Again, for this group of people, that will switch them off. They'll put up the defense there, they'll put up their defensive mechanisms, and the messages won't get through. There is a 4-minute video about this, but I think in the interest of time, we might skip it, especially given the technical issues we had before. But I think the last slide is actually happily very similar to Dr. Fuller's last slide, which was that we really want to focus on the positive messaging. I particularly like this photo by big sort of Hammersmith Broadway, lots of poppies and trees. And in fact, the world where we are tackling climate change effectively and the ecological emergency is one where the borough is greener, which is more beautiful. It also reduces flood risk. If people are walking and cycling more, they are healthier, they're saving money, and the air is cleaner. So these are all things really we want to be doing anyway. And that probably summarizes the way that we would want to frame our messaging. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. That's brilliant. Now, I'm going to ask a question first because I'm interested in that last point that you made, how people respond to the messaging. How are people how are we going to approach the people in this borough about wood burning stoves? We've got Jeff Cowett from communications as well as Mark Tomlinson from engagement. Because how do we start this conversation? Because if we go straight in with negative messaging, we're going to get people pushed back. You've got two sorts of people. What are your thoughts? How do we start?
Thank you, Chair. I think the answer is always with data. I think that's the best place to start when it comes to fixing a problem or addressing a problem. Councillor Afonso has made a similar point about understanding the problem and therefore getting closer to addressing the problem via communications to achieve the solution. Dr. Fuller's points about the air quality data, London has a problem. I think that we can assume that that is a fact. H&F has the style and era of homes that are likely to be burning solid fuel. We know that as a fact. It's happening in more affluent households, apparently. And I think finding that data about the science locally and the problem then leads us to how we target the communications. The Global Action Plan, who presented to the Mayor of London earlier this month on exactly the same topic, comes to some of the same conclusions that Dr. Fuller did, which is that to hit that audience who is most likely to be burning solid fuel at home in that era of house or that style or type of house that is prevalent in H&F is very effective via social platform called Nextdoor, largely because of the demographic that are on Nextdoor, the age, the affluence, the homeowners. And I think that starting with a campaign that understands that data and has analyzed the air quality science of it, targeting via Nextdoor or platforms with that type of audience should be the most effective to create an educational, informative campaign about the dangers of that behavior of solid fuel burning. And I think that's where you would want to start in terms of spreading the awareness and de-romanticizing the aesthetic value in terms of creating air that is better for everybody.
So are you suggesting on Nextdoor having that engagement measured to start engaging on Nextdoor and then measure that and from that work out who's got wood burning stoves, or start by trying to collect data by doing one of the like DEFRA did, either a survey or group analysis, invitations, etc. What do you think?
If we go on the Mayor of London study from Global Action Plan, they have already found through their use of Nextdoor that targeted population at 55 age to 64 is the population that is responding most to the wood burning campaign that is already run. So I think all these numbers and the data is showing a correlation between the home ownership, the types of home, the age and affluence of an audience. So if we use that as our starting point to target, then I think that is an effective place to start. I do think that some extra study about the particular nature of what H&F has as its population or its housing stock would be useful. More data is always better than less, but I think we can make some very sound assumptions from the Global Action Plan, from Dr. Fuller, from the type of work that Mark has been doing with his audience, is that is where we should start. And I think the goal should always be at this point, not on the fines and enforcement as a starting point, but on the information and education, because I think you can have an easier win up front by just spreading the information and demystifying some of the issues of solid fuel burning. From there, you can go onwards and you can look at targeting even more specific groups. So schools, for instance, you're talking about a reverse peer pressure of children influencing at home almost by what they learn at school, which is very useful. Or also the Global Action Plan specifically targeted not just demographics, but also time of year. So your campaign timing is very important from what they found, which is that you want to begin the campaign sort of late summer, early autumn, at the point where people are starting to think about making the purchase of a wood burner. And then you follow that up in during the winter of saying, you know, this is a very harmful activity. So the timing is important, the target is important, the data is important. And from that, I think you come to the conclusion that Nextdoor as a platform in H&F, having about a third of the adult population already engaged, is a very useful place. It has paid big dividends with a campaign that we're running at the moment about clean air neighborhoods, which has been hugely well received in terms of the click-through rate of the adverts and paid promotion that we've run on the platform. We are at its peak 5% higher, or sorry, 500% higher than Nextdoor would have anticipated for our clicks. So we have had a huge impact on people's understanding of how the clean air neighborhoods work and what the objectives are to clean the air and how the scheme works on a practical level. It's important, again, to start with the information side and then move from there. So I think that is a useful starting point when it comes to solid fuel burning.
That's really interesting. I'm going to step back at this point because there's only a few more minutes. Who would like to, may I pass over to Councillor James?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask a question both to Dr. Foley and to follow on from what you were just saying. On the basis that you're talking about particles travelling very quickly from Paris to Newcastle and then to Little Hammersmith and Fulham, does this really need to be a national or at least sort of linked in with other neighbouring authorities? So I suppose the scientific question is for you, and if so, I'd be interested in terms of any strategy to link up with others to ensure it's effective.
I think that it is a very large scale problem, but it starts on the decisions that people make in their own homes. So it is possible to reduce it down to that point, and that's where the behavioural change is going to happen. In terms of consistent messaging with others, then I think there's a very big opportunity to do that. But you know, I'll defer to the comms specialists here. But I think it's about changing the narrative. I think on one of my slides, and perhaps in my response to you, Councillor Melton, I said we just have to change the narrative and get over this message that, you know, wood burning is not climate neutral, it's adverse for climate, and it is the most polluting way to heat your home. These should be the starting points, really. But there is a lot of resistance here. When there was one study where they showed people that were actually polluting their families within their own homes from the wood burners they had, and half of the people decided that they liked wood burning so much they were just going to carry on, and the other half did very small changes to their behavior, which wouldn't really have made much difference, but made them feel as though they were doing something. So it is really quite difficult, and we have to really start by changing the narrative. Maybe that it's actually acceptable within a neighbourhood to burn wood. You know, do we have wood burning and the impact on your neighbours? Is it like noise pollution?
Yeah.
Do we have to be starting to raise that point? You know, one wood burner, DEFRA's expert committee calculated a modern wood burner and a modern HGV. So the emissions from one wood burner equivalent to around 7 HGVs. And would you think it's socially acceptable if your neighbours were driving 6 lorries up and down your road all evening?
Part of the messaging. Yeah.
Sorry, I gave too long an answer. I beg your pardon.
But I was just going to say that I think the data shows that London has a problem. So the incentive is for London as a place to pick that up. And so we can certainly help lobby London councils and the Mayor of London in terms of picking up our lead, if we were to continue or to start this campaign. And I think that in the past, those audiences have been very willing to pick up a campaign that has worked successfully in a particular borough and rolling it out across London. And that is, you know, some of the challenges of having 33 boroughs in London is that, you know, everyone is doing something slightly different, but good practice in communications is often mirrored. And we saw this in COVID quite clearly, where the best ideas and the best solutions were shared and adapted quickly. So I think the data is persuasive. London has a problem. I think that's we can assume that that is a factual problem for all of London, and that while other boroughs might approach it from a slightly different way, I think what we know about H&F in a very digital borough is that this type of paid promotion on social media platforms can work.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have Councillor Melton.
Thanks. And your question actually maybe inadvertently touches many different departments within the council. So, for example, we have smarter transport and education teams with respect to the question on schools. There is, for instance, a TfL scheme called STARS that is about helping schools to take measures that will promote active travel. So that's a combination.
For managing.
Thank you. Well, the Sustainability Champions pilot that I mentioned earlier, that's coming to an end at the end of this month, so very shortly. That has certain metrics which are about the number of people recruited as volunteers, number of workshops held, that sort of thing. Those, I would caution though, those are more outcomes. The measurable impact is a certain neighborhood driving less. You'd need to look at traffic data, but it's certainly much more difficult to analyze.
If I've understood correctly, then the campaigns that currently run do have some quantitative outputs, but it's a few steps away from getting towards those policies.
That's correct, and it's not something that's particular to our borough. There are many boroughs have similar sorts of programs, and measuring the impact on the ground is challenging.
Just forward us.
Thank you. I'm now going to go to residents if there's any questions. Thank you. If you push the green button.
Sorry, I'll try and get it through really quickly. Just an observation. It's not part of my question, but Sadiq, you mentioned 40,000 deaths. Sadiq Khan, I just saw that he'd been asked to retract. He said 4,000 and he'd been asked to retract it. Just an observation. I'm going to do a bit more research on it.
I think that was I think I talked about UK figures, and then for the London figures, I quoted the report that was prepared for the Met.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll double check that. Going back to, I provided the panel with some research because I'm trying to understand climate change. So in my attempt to research climate change emergency, the most common piece of information that I come across is that all scientists agree that we are in a climate change emergency. But upon some further simple research, I just found that that's not true. So the Global Climate Intelligence Group have 15,000 signatories worldwide of prominent scientists and experienced advisors in the field of science that disagree with the statement that there is universal agreement and that we are in any form of climate change emergency.
Caroline, sorry, I'm going to interrupt at this point because we've got very, very little time.
Okay, I'm going to
left.
get through my question.
We can't enter into a discussion about the
I'm going to get
actual
through my question.
climate change
Absolutely,
emergency. Sorry.
absolutely. So I'll just get through to my question. So my question does bear to what happened last time. So they state that climate policy relies on inadequate models. Climate models have many shortcomings and are not remotely plausible as policy tools. They do not only exaggerate the effects of greenhouse gases, they also ignore the fact that enriching the atmosphere with CO2 is beneficial. I find that very worrying. Sorry, I'll get through this very quickly, but I do find this very worrying. And that it's all being done on the premise of saving the planet from a gas that actually gives life to all living creatures on Earth. CO2 is plant food the basis of all life on Earth.
Yeah,
CO2
Caroline,
is a pollutant. Okay.
I'm
okay,
sorry, I
let
need
me
your
get to my
question
let me get
or
to my
we need
question.
to-
Okay, I'm just
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about this. This is my research.
I appreciate
So I'm
your
very
concern,
concerned
and
about why
we
you're
will
all in
take on
agreement,
your,
and I'm
but-
seeing research. Okay, I'll get to my question.
your
Okay.
question, please.
Yeah, so basically, I've got a list of a load of hoaxes, climate change hoaxes, so most notably the ozone layer. And most recently, in 2020, Imperial College London wrongly predicted a pandemic of epic proportions that also turned out to be inaccurate. So in light of the evidence that I've provided to the panel by email, which I'd like noted, please, Debbie, I provided the panel evidence of my findings. On the military having full control of the weather by 2025, my question is, who's funding your research? And also, what scrutiny measures are in place to determine the credibility of the research and the evidence presented to the panel? And how does this panel weigh up that evidence?
Okay, we have received your email and we are researching it. We have looked at the piece from the American study in 1996 about the military taking over the weather. But unfortunately, 27 years later, the military haven't, it seems, come up with the technology. So I will ask Dr. Fuller to come back to you on who finances his research. But I don't think it's really pertinent to the discussion we're having about wood burning. I'm sorry, Caroline, but I'll ask Dr. Fuller to come back about that financing, but it's not relevant to this conversation. Thank you. We have a very, very little time left. I will come back to you on your email. We'll come back to you in writing.
Yeah, so when can I expect, my last question was, when can I expect a reply to that? Because I'm very worried, very, very worried with what I've read and what I'm hearing.
I think
two completely different stories.
I think we can say within 2 weeks. I think 2 weeks would be a reasonable amount of time to come back on that. At the same point, we will come back to you at the same point. The climate emergency, we as a council have to parallel, we have to run our concern about it being a real effect alongside your concern about it being made up. So we've got to
absolutely, and we've just
to have a contingency and make sure that we are reacting to the science.
As I said, the most notable one is the pandemic model, which turned out to be inaccurate.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. We'll get back to you. Okay. Now, I'd like to thank everybody for their presentations. Really, really interesting. I think, I don't know, Mark or Jeff, if you'd like to have the last word about strategy, really.
I think if we want to talk about data, to go back to your question, so there is a campaign that has this type of data, and I think this is where the strategy comes from, which is the Clean Air Neighborhood. In the first 2 years of the trial, we know that 8,000 fewer cars a day were traveling through that area. That resulted in taking 1 ton a day of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that makes all of a sudden you do have the data there. That is a campaign that we can show you. And that is not just, a communications led campaign that is coming from our highways and data scientists on the ground. The 23% reduction in traffic is a result of that as well. So when you start building up that data set from just the first 2 years of just the limited side of this trial in South Fulham, now expanded to the western side of Wandsworth Bridge Road, you start to build up a picture of what can be achieved in terms of cleaning the air, making the borough a greener and more pleasant place to live, and also making it more pleasant for residents that have experienced a high volume of traffic in their small roads now not having to be subjected to that. So I think, again, the data is the leading point. And yes, all campaigns that have either a serious endpoint in terms of either legislation or policy, even if it's just amongst these walls, need to have data, and they need to have these proof points, especially when there is money, taxpayers' money spent to promote them. There are other smaller behavioral change or good modeling that we do that doesn't necessarily need to have that point. Yes, you'd like to see that the campaign is effective, but it may not have an outcome that is tangible in a week or a day or in a moment, but it is over time builds up a picture of what Hammersmith and Fulham does collectively to take climate action or to take the objective of cleaning air and having a healthier life and enjoyment. And I think those things are cumulative and the data will show them in time, but we will always be interested in following the data and refining campaigns to make sure that they become more effective or are more effective as they move along. So yes, data is always available if you're interested.
Well, thank you very much. May I thank you again for the presentations. I think the committee moved to agree with both presentations, been excellent, and to reflect on those going forward. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. It was really amazing. Thank you, Dr. Fuller, and thank you, Mark Tomlinson, for your brilliant presentation. I think we have an action plan really coming from communications, which is an inform and educate plan before starting from Hammersmith and Fulham, because the likelihood of a national legislation that is enforceable with fines doesn't seem to be the most probable route, as it were. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and yes, thank you to our residents, and thank you for your questions. Thank you, councillors. Thank you. Oh. Oh, I'm sorry. I must give the dates of the future meetings. Yes. The 18th of July, 23, the 21st of November, 2023, 6th of February, 2024, and the 23rd of April, 24. I'd like to thank everyone for attending or watching tonight's meeting. Thank you.